Welcome everyone to the SERT Climate and Disaster Resilience Lecture Series 2020-2021, Session 2 entitled System Dynamics Modeling for Quantifying City Resilience. Our session today is broadcasted live on the Facebook page of SERT as seen on your screens. Please be guided by the house rules for today's session. All guests and participants are automatically muted upon entry. The ceremony will be recorded for documentation purposes. For panelists, you will be hearing a bell when you have 3 minutes left and again in the last minute. For attendees, please send your questions through the chat box at the bottom of your screen so our team can note this and raise it during our open forum. And remember to address your questions to the panelists or speakers. We begin this webinar with welcome messages from our main convener, Dr. Emma Porio of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Ateneo de Manila, and project leader and principal investigator of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project. I now welcome Dr. Emma Porio.
Me, Ina. Hello. You muted me, Ina. Can I share my screen now?
Yes.
Can you see my screen now? Hello. Ina.
I don't see
Ina.
it.
You don't see it?
I see it now.
I'm sharing screen, so you should be able to see it.
I see it now.
Hello. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. In behalf of Father Roberto Yap, project holder of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines and president of the Ateneo de Manila University, and to our partners in Manila Observatory, Ateneo Innovation Center, and the National Resilience Council, especially Ms. Tony Yolo Loizaga, our partner universities and University of the Philippines, Visayas, Ateneo de Naga University, Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Muntinlupa, and in behalf also of our LGU partners in Naga City, the Naga City Resilience Council, Iloilo City Resilience Council, Muntinlupa Resilience Council, Quezon City, Pasig, and Valenzuela. The Coastal Cities at Risk project, as you can see in the screen, is a transdisciplinary action research project, and it basically aims to enhance the capacity of coastal cities in Metro Manila, Iloilo, Naga, through better understanding of the complexity and dynamics of climate and disaster risk by undertaking new transitory action research. 2, we want to build the capacity of resilient scientists and practitioners. And 3, we want to strengthen public-private partnerships for resilience that will inform the resilience planning and development of cities through the principles of transitory action research, which is co-creation, co-management, and co-ownership in resilience building by local and national governments, academia and scientific institutions, private sector, and other stakeholders. Coastal cities will be better equipped to prepare, adapt, and transform for a resilient future. So this afternoon's session on systems dynamics by Kendra Gutangco Gonzalez, she is the work package leader for systems tools, and she will be sharing with us what kinds of tools we can use in terms of understanding cities as systems. How do we engage our stakeholders through this tool and the like? So without much ado, I would like to say that, this particular work package has been very instrumental in allowing us to understand how science-based resilience planning takes place by the use of this tool. So without much ado, we welcome you and we listen to Dr. Gatanco Gonzalez team in sharing with us what they have learned in terms of using systems dynamics and systems analysis thinking in understanding climate disaster risk and how do we reduce the risk and promote resilience in our partner communities and LGUs. Thank you very much. Welcome, and we hope you'll enjoy us, and you'll enjoy our first of a series of climate and disaster resilience series. The systems dynamics talk, which is this is the second part, is the first. It's our October-November session of the climate and disaster resilience lecture series for 2020-21. In January, we will have the economics team. In February, we will have the Manila Observatory team with the partners and the partner universities. And then we will end up in March with the gender month, gender, climate, and resilience. So thank you very much. Welcome, and hope you'll have a good time. Let's have a good time listening to Dr. Gutanco Gonzalez team. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Tina?
Emporio. Now we want to share with everyone a welcome remarks video from the Dean of the School of Science and Engineering of Ateneo de Manila University, Dr. Evangeline P. Bautista. She's also the Associate Professor of the Department of Mathematics in Ateneo de Manila. This opening remarks was taken from our first session, which we conducted last month, October 22. It was also a webinar on systems thinking. So, play video.
Good afternoon. I am happy to know that a webinar on systems thinking is actually taking place, and even happier that the lecture will be led by Dr. Kendra Gutanco Gonzalez. Kendra has been promoting systems thinking ever since she returned to Ateneo after her PhD, and she is the best person to deliver this webinar. I am hoping that after this, more people will be inspired to learn the basics of the discipline and apply it in whatever it is that they are doing. I have come to realize that there is no discipline more important in problem solving in practically any area. A problem solver applying systems thinking is one who can view the problem in a much broader perspective, and the solution proposed by a systems thinker will cover greater ground and anticipate or even manage the ripples that the solution may cause. Our world is not a simple one, and I believe that we would have been in a much better place now if our leaders had been trained in this discipline. Then solutions will be good solutions and not solutions that would give rise to new and more difficult problems to contend with. Once again, I congratulate Dr. Kendra and her team for putting together this webinar, and I thank Dr. Emma Porio for her efforts in organizing this under the SICAR PH project, which is primarily supported by IDRC Canada. Many thanks as well to the Ateneo Research Institute of Science and Engineering, the Environmental Science Department, and the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability for this very relevant project. I wish you all a good day and a very productive webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Bautista. I now would like to introduce today's program flow. We will begin with an introduction to the systems approach to be led by Dr. Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez of the Ateneo de Manila's Department of Environmental Science. Dr. Kendra will be followed by Mr. Joseph Emmanuel Litam, who will give the presentation on Urban Ecosystems Resilience Index UERI model. Afterward, Dr. Gotanco with Ms. Katrina Abenohar will give a presentation on the Socio-Economic Resilience Model. This will be followed by a presentation and demonstration of the Integrated Urban Services Resilience Index, IUSRI, model to be led by Mr. Joaquin Ignacio Campos. We'll be having a short open forum to be led by Ms. Jairus Osol, to be followed by closing remarks from Dr. Fabian Antonio David. We now officially begin today's lecture on the systems approach, to be led by Dr. Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez. Dr. Kendra is faculty at the Department of Environmental Science and work package leader in the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines. She is also a program manager for the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Program of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. I now hand over the virtual floor to Dr. Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez.
Thank you, Ina, and thank you everyone for coming to today's webinar. Now, let me just share my screen. So today's topic is Systems Dynamics Modeling for Quantifying City Resilience, and I'm joined by my other team members. And we just like to acknowledge again the Coastal Cities at Risk project, primarily funded by IDRC, with support from the University Research Council and the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and Ateneo Research Institute of Science and Engineering. Okay, so let's just start with the basics to make sure that we're all on the same page. What is a system, and how do we differentiate a system from a bunch of parts? First, a system has components that fit together in specific ways, so specific relationships, in order to achieve a goal or purpose or to perform a function. So, a key question here, and there'll be a number of key questions later, does the structure of the system result in a behavior that helps it accomplish its purpose? So the structure of a system is the specific way that the parts are put together. And if they're put together properly, then you will see the purpose or the goal of the system being fulfilled. But if not, then we have a problem that needs to be diagnosed. So we can think of the city as a system. For example, who are the different stakeholders in the city, the different organizations? What resources do they have at their disposal? Those are the components of your system. They interact with each other in certain ways. These ways can be dictated by formal laws, policies, and guidelines, or they can be informal relationships. And then what is the vision of the city? What is its goal? Which sectors does it want to promote? What quality of life does it want to achieve for its constituencies? So that's the city as a system. So when you think about systems thinking as a discipline, it's really the recognition that it's the structure of the system that creates the conditions that we face. It is a recognition that because of the relationships between the components, they feed back onto each other to create a complexity that traditional linear thinking processes can no longer adequately address. So we need to be more sensitive to this circular feedback nature of the world that we live in. So systems thinking is a disciplined approach for examining problems more completely and accurately before acting, so that we can develop more efficient solutions rather than just jumping to the quick options. In systems thinking, we recognize what we call the principle of emergent property. So those of you who teach environmental science or biology might be familiar with this. Simply speaking, it's that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. You can take a system apart and look at the individual components in isolation, but no matter how deeply you study each individual component, it still doesn't give you a complete picture of the system because we're lacking the interactions that only arise when the components are put together. Now, what is system dynamics? So you can take it from the term dynamic. It's something that is changing over time. So system dynamics is a field of study focused on analyzing how the underlying structure of your system can lead to behaviors and trends that evolve over time. For example, you can think about the global climate system. So how do the atmosphere, land, ocean work together to regulate the climate system? How are they affected by human activities? And as a result of all these interconnections, what are the trends that we see in the climate system? So what's happening to our temperature? What's happening to our rainfall? Or we can also apply the same frame of mind to development trends. These are outcomes of institutional and governance structures. So what's happening with our economy, for example, that's a result of how our economic institutions and our governance institutions are put together and the types of decisions that they make. Now, way back in 1969, J. Forrester, one of the pioneers of systems thinking, had actually written a book called Urban Dynamics. Here, he identified key parameters that affect whether a city grows or decays. So these key parameters include things such as population, housing, and industry. And it was quite controversial at the time because there were counterintuitive results. So commonly accepted plans for improving an urban area, such as giving external financial assistance, turned out not to work so well for the city in the long run. So this is an example of the interactions that he is looking at in this book. This is a causal loop diagram. So just a quick overview. Whenever you see an arrow from one variable to another, it means that A leads to B. O stands for opposite direction, S for same direction. So for example, where you have a greater number of businesses, you will have fewer people who are unemployed. So greater of A leads to less of B, so they move in the opposite direction. If there are more people who are unemployed, you would need more low-income housing. However, if fewer people are unemployed, then you will have less of a need for low-income housing. They move in the same direction, so S. R stands for reinforcing feedback. So it's a story in which your initial stimulus is reinforced or amplified or pushed even further in that direction. Whereas B stands for balancing feedback, where you have a change of direction, or the story is that you counter the initial stimulus. For example, if we take this loop, R3, more businesses lead to fewer unemployed, lead to less of a need, less low-income housing, which means more land is available for businesses to thrive. And with more businesses, again, fewer unemployed and so on. So it's reinforcing. But it also goes in the other direction. If there are not enough businesses, you have many people who are unemployed, a lot of low-income housing, which restricts the land available for businesses, which makes it even less feasible for businesses to develop. So it's reinforcing, but in the negative direction. Okay, so these are just some of the examples of the processes that he looked at. And as I said, he found that things that might have worked in the short term weren't so beneficial to the city in the long term. So we really need to look at changes through time when we talk about system dynamics. Okay. And last concept I'd like to introduce is that of resilience. So Meadows, another pioneer, had defined resilience as the measure of a system's ability to survive and persist within a variable environment. And we'll say more about that later. So just to wrap up the foundational concepts part, some basic questions to ask about systems. So one, can you identify the parts, so the components of the system? Two, do the parts affect each other and how? Those are the relationships. 3, what happens when all the parts are functioning together? So what is the overall function, purpose, goal, objective that they're supposed to accomplish? Do the parts together produce an effect that's different from the effect of each part on its own? This is the principle of emergent properties, the things that arise when they're working together. Does the effect or the behavior over time persist in a variety of circumstances? So there's a dynamic nature. And is the behavior affected by these disturbances? How? Can the parts act together in such a way as to re-establish the original behavior? So we're talking about resilience or stability of the system. And to answer these questions, right, to investigate this, there are a variety of tools, ranging from the more conceptual end, applying a systems perspective and using diagrams, to the more technical end, where we create stock and flow structures and run, add equations and values and run simulations. So in the first webinar, if you had joined it last October, we had discussed more of the conceptual end, and in this webinar, we're more on the technical side. So we've been working on computer modeling using system dynamics software and translating our understanding of the system, its components, and their relationships into the languages of stocks and flows and the exchange of information. So the structure of the system as represented by stocks, flows, and information exchange. Just to give an idea, what does this look like? Here is a very simple causal loop diagram. If you have some stock of natural resource, say oil reserves, we consume this. So the more reserves there are, the more we consume. But the more we consume, the fewer are left in the reserve. So as I mentioned, the oil reserve is the stock. The consumption is the flow that depletes the stock. We add values to this in our modeling platform, and then we will see how the stock of oil reserves gets depleted over time depending on the rate of consumption. The rate of consumption being modified by the information on how much oil there is left. Here's another example. You can talk about fish stock. The flows that add to it are the hatching of the fish, and then you have death of the fish, taking away from that stock, and the death is modified by information on carrying capacity. So how many fish can fit in that ecosystem? We can add values, simulate, and we might get a profile like this. And this is actually a small piece of a much bigger model that the fish banks model, which we call it, that's good for getting insight on natural resource management. Okay, so how do we bring all of this to bear on modeling urban resilience? So we're looking for a way to characterize the resilience of a city that in a means that is holistic, meaning multidimensional, capturing the different aspects of the city, measurable, dynamic, and actionable. Okay, something that makes benchmarking possible so we can also track how far we are from a goal. Now, I had introduced the term resilience earlier. And how does that apply now when we talk about urban resilience or resilience in cities? So Meadows had said it's the ability to survive and persist in variable environments. In my own interpretation, I take it to mean the ability to sustain services to achieve its vision for a certain quality of life of its constituencies amidst changes or disturbances. These changes can be slow. You almost don't perceive that they're happening, and they come with the pressures of population growth and urbanization, or they can be slow-going hazards like sea level rise. Okay? Or these disturbances can be the more acute shocks, an earthquake, a typhoon, and so on. So we often like to say that resilience is bouncing back. And that term has been very much criticized because, well, if our state was not desirable to begin with, okay, we were suboptimal even before the disturbance came, then why would we want to bounce back to that, right? So my interpretation here is that when Meadows said it's the ability to reestablish original behavior, it's not so much bouncing back to some pre-disturbance state, but it's the ability to adjust and adapt to changing conditions so that you are still able to achieve the goal, the purpose that you set out for yourself, for the city, that the city has defined for itself. Okay. So the city, in the way that it adjusts, it may look a bit different, but if it's still oriented towards achieving that goal, then that is what we mean by bouncing back or re-establishing original behavior, that we keep going back, we adjust so that we can achieve the goal we set out for ourselves. So, is there a way to measure if the city is indeed functioning optimally in terms of the services that it should be providing to its citizens? And can we make this measurement holistic, dynamic, and useful for benchmarking? So we are using here the concept of a services approach to urban resilience. We have the almost or perhaps exponential population growth and pressures from urbanization. We have more frequent and severe hazards. And the city has to adjust. If it's able to, then it can become more and more optimal in time, even with these conditions. But if not, it becomes less optimal and hence less resilient. So a city is less resilient when it's unable to provide the services that its constituencies need, but it can become more resilient in the midst of these pressures and still be able to provide enough or more services than are needed. Or here, we can stay at least minimum compliance. We meet the demand. So we define a score that is calibrated in this manner. A resilience score that is equal to 1 means that we're just meeting what we need. So supply just meets demand, or the quality of the environment just meets the standard. If it's less than, then what we need ideally has not been met. But if it's more than 1, then the ideal capacity is exceeded. We also defined a self-sufficiency score, just something for us to track whether the capacity was met entirely by the city itself, which in this case is quite rare. Our cities are so interconnected, and especially in Metro Manila, goods and people just flow between the boundaries, right? So perhaps some of that capacity is met by drawing from resources from outside the city. And in the face of changing climate, for example, right, where we have to think about how our supply chains are affected down the road, this may be a useful index to have. Then with this framing for a resilience score and self-sufficiency score, we developed the Integrated Urban Services Resilience Index and created a model to simulate this over time. Now, this index is made up of 2 components: the Urban Ecosystem Resilience Index, which we call UERI, and the Socio-Economic Resilience Index, or the SERI. We'll hear more about this later, but just to say that on the UERI side, here we're looking at ecosystem services. So provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. While on the SERI side, we're looking at the social services of health, education, and protection. We've included housing for informal settlers and some measures of poverty and employment. And we have made 2 versions of this model. One is customized for Pasig City, and the other one is tweaked for Valenzuela City. So, to present more about the Urban Ecosystem Resilience Index component, of the model, I turn you over to Mr. Joseph Litang.
Hello everyone, I'll just share my screen. Um, can everyone see?
Yes.
Hello, so I'll be presenting the UERI, but before I go there, I'd like to define first what it means for a city to be urban ecosystem resilient. So cities in this definition are framed like ecosystems. So you have the natural ones like forests, the oceans, and they all provide their own set of services. So cities also provide their own services. And the goal of cities is to provide these services over time for all the generations to come. So for them to be urban ecosystem resilient, they need to be able to adapt and transform in the face of all these disturbances such as socioeconomic and demographic changes, as well as long-term hazards to sustain the delivery of all types of urban ecosystem services to achieve sustainable development. So, what are the four types of services? So, we're using this framework that's often used for natural systems. So, I'll go through them real quick. So, the provisioning services, they're for our basic needs the water, food, and electricity. Then we have the regulating services. So, these services make sure that conditions are optimal for life. So, we have the air regulation, carbon sequestration, wastewater and solid waste management, and river rainwater conveyance. Then we move on to the cultural services for our well-being, such as green space benefits. Then we have the supporting services, such as the land use change. So supporting services make sure that all the other services work or they function well. Are these services related? Well, yes, there are trade-offs. Suppose, for example, you want more vegetation in the city, you would have to devote a certain amount of land for agricultural purpose. So the benefits of this add more food as well as more regulation from vegetation. So you know how plants can help clean the air around them and they can help sequester carbon. So these are the good parts. But when you have more food, you emit more waste from its production and from food waste. Additionally, you would need more water use. So there are existing trade-offs between these services. So, how did we create the model? Well, we first had to understand what our city is, or the system or the structure of the city. So, on the left, you can see something called a causal loop diagram. So, this explains the interrelationship of different variables. To give you a short summary, let's say that as your population grows, so does your demand for your provisioning services. Because we're gonna need more food, water, and electricity. But as you consume those services, you tend to have more waste in the form of food waste, solid waste, wastewater emissions, carbon emissions, and stuff like that. So you would need a lot more regulation services to treat the waste produced. And for certain services, they require land. So we would need to devote different types of land matching the service. But remember, cities only have a limited amount of available land that they can convert. So we want to check over time whether the city is meeting the services needs along with the matching population growth. So now that we understand the system, we try to convert it into a quantifiable model. So we get variables that can be quantified. As you can see on the right, that's what the stock flow diagram is. So the scores of the different types of services all connect to one urban ecosystem resilience index. So how did we derive the scoring? So for provisioning services, we use a demand over supply. So it's more of like how much water do we still need given this number of people? Do we meet the demand? Does the supply meet the demand? So in the model, we have, as you can see on the right, a bunch of sliders, which the government units, our partners, can adjust depending on the data that they collect. Is the supply increasing over time? Or is the demand increasing over time? So they can manipulate. The regulating services use two types of equations, the actual or standard. So For example, let's take recycling. So our recycling rate is this much. Does it meet the standards set by DENR? Or what is the gap between the actual and the standard? So this should serve as an indicator for what the services or the treatment services should achieve. Then we have capacity over actual. How much are we treating over time versus how much waste we're generating over time? Is the gap big enough that there's too much waste being produced? So we want to check that and we will factor that in the UERI. We have the supporting services for the land use, but there is no equation type here because the supporting services role is to make sure all the other services work. So these are inputs actually to the different models. So if you remember my example on food, if we increase the fraction of total land devoted for agricultural services, it will actually improve the food services. But take note, since we do have a limited amount of land, if you already devote it for agricultural, then it cannot be used for anything else unless they do practice mixed land use. And lastly, the cultural services follow a demand over supply. So we're basing this on a per capita approach. So a certain person needs an X amount of land to enjoy the cultural benefits. So do we have enough land that serves only for cultural services? And does it match the amount of people in the city? Can everyone access these cultural spaces? Lastly, we also made a self-sufficiency index. So how much resources are we sourcing internally, or whether the city is able to provide this internally versus how much are we getting outside. So this is more of for cities whose goals are to improve the services that they do provide within without having to rely as much on the outside. So I will be passing to Doc Kendra for the socio-economic part, the SERI.
Thank you, Joe. And now let me continue from there. Oops, sorry, not yet sharing my screen. Okay. Okay. So the other component is the Socio-Economic Resilience Index model, looking at how we can characterize and measure the performance of socio-economic based services. And now, as a caveat right up front, this was really challenging to do, as there are so many dynamics in the socio-economic and political system that are not easily translated into the concept of services. Okay, so for this first edition of the model, what we have as part of the scope are social services in the form of health, education, and protection services. We have modules looking at poverty and employment, and a module looking on housing for informal settler families. And why are all of these important from a resilience perspective? So, of course, on the health side, as, as we have all experienced the past few months, it's very important for our health systems to remain robust and not break down in disaster situations and not be overwhelmed by patients. But even without a hazard, even without an immediate threat, the health system should be able to adequately care for the well-being of the city constituents so that we can avoid the additional vulnerability to disasters due to fragile health conditions. So for the education, the education system, of course, is important for constituencies to have at least primary, secondary education so that we can have higher human and financial capital down the road. And that will give access to better opportunities, for example, job opportunities, with which they can earn a regular income, which also helps in building resilience. And then, of course, for the protection services like law enforcement and firefighting, it's important for the LGU to become a safer place and to have the capacity to maintain peace and order. So these are the personnel and the facilities for each of these three systems that we are looking at. On the poverty and employment side, so businesses provide local employment, and they're also at risk when it comes to hazards. It's important that they remain resilient in order to maintain that employment, to maintain that, to make jobs available, right? And to provide goods and services. They also contribute to the LGU budget through business taxes. Then we're also briefly looking at income poverty and how far below the income threshold the families are in the city. Then lastly, the housing situation for resilience, because informal settlements are often found in hazardous locations like flood-prone areas or by riverbanks and under electricity transmission lines. So unsafe construction and poor living conditions put them more at risk, make them more vulnerable to hazards. So operationalizing these three categories, under the health, education, and protection services, we're looking at the personnel and facilities needed given the size of the population. For employment, we look at the jobs that are needed given the size of the working age population. And then lastly, we look at the housing needed given the number of informal settler families. So just briefly going through these subsystems. On the HEP subsystem, we have a general stock flow that might look like this. So a stock for the number of the personnel, be it doctors, nurses, midwives, teachers, or the facilities. How these personnel increase over time, for example, through hiring. If it's facilities, how it's increased through procurement, right? And how the stock may also decrease through retiring, if it's personnel, and also through the normal wear and tear at the end of useful life if it's equipment. And the modeling philosophy here is mainly goal seeking. So we have the local government targets, for example, for each of these subsystems. And we look at over time how the LGUs are able to adjust to meet those targets. Now, these are mainly from the socio-ecological profiles, but we also have built into the model capacity to have alternative benchmarks to capture demand changes within the population for events, for example, like the COVID-19 impacts. So we can instead look at the health targets in terms of the patients per year that we should be able to accommodate, the average length of stay in the hospitals, and hospitalization rate. In a sense, these actually can end up being higher targets compared to what's in this table. Right? For the poverty and employment subsystem, so as I mentioned, this has to do with businesses, and we're looking at how businesses have grown over the years and contribute to jobs to residents within the city. But again, caveat here, the model is simplified. We admit that there's still a lot of complexity with business dynamics and what are the factors that would encourage a business to establish or not to invest in the city. Then, as I also mentioned, on the poverty end, we compute for the total annual income shortfall. It's an indicator to have a better idea of the number of families or number of people that are below the poverty line and how far below they are. So it's an indicator that the local government can keep track of in benchmarking their socioeconomic performance. Then for the housing system, we're mainly focused on public housing. So the housing for low income or the informal settler families that could be built within the city or outside the city. And then the SERI model also has a self-sufficiency component. Again, looking at the amount of service available internally compared to what is sourced externally. Or yes. And for employment, it's the fraction of the jobs for residents that's provided within the city over the total number of jobs that are being availed of by the city residents. And for housing, it's the fraction of housing relocation projects that are in the city as opposed to the total both in and out of the city. So that's our measure of self-sufficiency. Now, in this model, we also have some parameters to simulate the COVID-19 pandemic. It was not something that we had in mind to include when we started this process, but it has become increasingly relevant over the past few months. So we've added in some capacity to simulate, for example, a wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this case, we had just tested a 3-month wave. At the time, we did not know it would be extending this long. Uh, and then part of the simulation are assumptions like needing to put in those higher targets for the health service. So using those alternative benchmarks and pegging it to the number of COVID-19 admitted patients. There are also modules put in to track costs. So in the health system, for example, costs that might be incurred for paying for the PPEs for medical professionals, for PhilHealth coverage, and even gadgets for online learning. And we also have the employment part of the model affected by COVID-19 in the form of increasing unemployment. There are additional costs as well incurred for the SAP program of families below that income poverty line. So this is a shock that we built into this version of the model. So now we're going to move on to the integration of the UERI and SERI and what some of the graphs look like under certain scenarios. So for this, I'm going to turn you over to Mr. Joaquin Campos.
Thank you, Doc Kendra. Okay, I'll be presenting my screen. Okay. Can it be seen? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so now I will be talking about what happens when we combine both the UERI and the SERI, and this results into the Integrated Urban Services Resilience Index, or as we like to call it, the IUSRI model, which talks about combining both the urban ecosystem services and the socio-economic services in a synergistic model. Okay, so this talks about how we integrated both the SERI and UERI variables, and we did that through factoring them with equal weights. This meant that we had to factor, but by changing the UERI, we also had to change the SERI proportional to it. In terms of the structure of these models, they were heavily based on the data sets collected and the amount and the type of data also collected. This meant that the UERI models of Pasig and Valenzuela had different structures when compared to the SERI models. In this model also, the population of the SERI was used as an input for the overall model to give a more age-specific, as population is a major factor and driver to urbanization. So in terms of these data sets, we also came up with different city priorities. Priority scenarios. These were based off the reported city priorities from the collected interview data. So for Pasig, under the UERI, we have two, the land use change and the refuse derived fuel scenarios. For the land use change scenario, we assume that a fraction of cultural areas, these are areas such as parks, that can be converted to green space or places with vegetation and services derived from them. For the refuse-derived fuel scenario, this is a system on a way to treat municipal waste and convert it to usable energy, such as electricity and the provisioning services. For the SERI, we have three, the health, the education, and the housing scenarios, which talk about a ratio of personnel, such as medical personnel and classrooms, as well as in-city housing units to the population within Pasig City. So how do these scenarios play out in the graphs and how did we integrate them? So as from the results, Here we can see the breakdown of first the UERI under both the BAU or the business as usual scenarios compared to the priority scenarios. So under the priority scenarios, we can see that the scores are slightly higher thanks to the different scenarios. For the RDF, we can see here a slight increase in the green line. And for the land use scenario, we can see that it, as a supporting service, factored into all the other scores and increased it slightly as well. For the SERI output graphs, we see both the BAU and the priority scenario, and we see the additional COVID-19 scenarios as well. In the priority scenario, it may not be easily seen as the graphs are quite small, but some services increased while some decreased because these were based off different LGU targets, such as the housing, which decreased, and the housing, which increased, and the health service, which decreased in score. For the COVID-19 scenario, which followed the business as usual scenario, here we see an initial dip in the graph due to an influx of COVID-19 patients and a higher health demand. It also factors in the increase in unemployment due to the lockdown in the first 3 months of this COVID-19 wave. Okay, so when putting them together, we can see here the comparison of SERI and UERI. And we can see here that the SERI scored higher than the UERI, while their priority scenario scored higher than their BAU counterparts. For the IUSRI score, we can see that the priority scenario scored higher than their BAU counterparts as well. Okay, so now that we've seen the scores, what are the implications of these graphs and what these priority scenarios mean? So in order to present that, the implications mean that in both scenarios, the IUSRI score of Pasig reaches 1. However, this score is achieved earlier in the priority scenarios. So while there's a slight difference, the priority scenario scored slightly higher. So in terms of the components, the SERI score was higher than the UERI. Based off the interviews and datasets collected, it was reported that Pasig City at this time focused more on the socio-economic development and could explain this. So delving more into the individual components, for the UERI, the availability of land determined the extent of improvements from land use to resilience. As we saw that it increased the score, but it's also limited by how much land per type is available. We can also see that the capacity of the RDF system was greater than the waste generated. This could be a good thing because it could also imply that it could service other areas outside of Pasig City. For the SERI, higher ratios resulted in more socioeconomic services. But as we saw in the score a while ago, it is good to be mindful about the targets and if they're appropriate to the city. Okay, so this concludes our part on Pasig, and I will move on to the priority scenarios based on for Valenzuela. All right. So for Valenzuela, we have the UERI again and the SERI. And under the UERI, we have the land use change, similar to Pasig, which assumes the fraction of cultural areas as green space again. And a new one, which is siltation. This is a system on how to check how much siltation and dredging can affect the resilience score. So this talks about a river and how much it can convey its rainwater, and as well as the flooding potential due to this if ever that happens. For the SERI, we have employment and housing. And once again, this talks about the ratio of personnel, and this time the off-city housing. Okay, so how did this affect the graphs and the results of this model? So here we can see in the priority scenarios for the UERI that the scores were much higher than that of the business as usual. We can see in the regulating that the siltation had an initial effect, however, was only a slight increase. We can see here the cultural score, or the gray line, to be much greater than the one in the BAU, and that could possibly mean that the land use change also affected it greatly. This is because in the cultural service, it factors in a lot of land, and a lot of cultural benefits derive from the amount of land per person. For the SERI, we see here the BAU and the priorities once again, and another COVID-19 graph. So in the priority scenarios, we can see that the scores were increased much greater, which means that the LGU targets, were more appropriate for the city. For the COVID-19 graph, we also see here this initial dip due to that influx of COVID-19 patients and the increase in unemployment rates. So putting them side by side, we see here that the SERI scored much higher than the UERI, and that the UERI graph actually plateaus while the SERI graph increases exponentially. And we can also see here that the priority scenarios scored much higher than the BAU counterparts as well. Based on these scores, we can see that the IUSRI priority scenarios also scored higher than its business as usual for Valenzuela City. So what are the implications from these graphs for Valenzuela City? So for Valenzuela City, while the IUSRI score did not reach 1 for the priority scenarios, it is still indicative of improvements compared to the BAU, as seen in the initial score. And while this is not, while the time frame of 50 years did not reach the score of 1, it could still reach in a longer time span. Similar to Pasig, the SERI score was higher than the UERI. As we saw earlier, the score of the UERI also plateaued, and it could be explained by the availability of land. Changes in land also improve the cultural and regulating services, as the amount of land also influences the amount of services derived from. For the SERI, additional housing to match population growth rates improve the resilience score due to the more appropriate LGU targets based on which influenced more personnel, in proportion to the population of Valenzuela City. Okay, so given these implications, what takeaway can we get from these implications on an overall note? So based on these implications, we can see that the IUSRI model provides a more holistic view of the system to assess overall ecosystem resilience. This goes for both the SERI and the UERI, and that there exist trade-offs between these two services and the variables within them. For example, generating more food may cause more emissions, but a growing population may drive the demand for more food provisioning as well. This is why we have to be mindful about these trade-offs, as the availability of land is an overarching constraint to improve or serve as a detriment to the urban ecosystem services. This is why setting appropriate LGU targets can help meet future demands and promote proper allocation of resources. So with the model made for the IUSRI, it can help in rationalizing decisions for future plans by providing adjustable parameters based on the development goals of the city. So you saw those city priorities. But in order to make these decisions more robust, we have to prioritize consistent data gathering, which looks more into the key indicators to check the interconnections through time, as this is a system dynamics model. Another improvement that can be made to the model is the exploration of different data sets and methods, which can be useful for decision making, but have not yet been included in the mandated data processing processes. Sorry. So to summarize, what the UERI, SERI, IUSRI, and resilience have taught us, we can say that resilience in the context of cities as systems can be conceptualized as the ability to sustain key services amidst changing conditions and shocks. So we can see here that resilience is very tied in with the concept of sustainability, and that it tries to meet future demands without compromising the present. These changing conditions and shocks include the increasing pressure of population growth and urbanization, perhaps, and as well as the mentioned natural or man-made hazards. So in order to check how these systems or services perform in the face of these natural conditions and shocks, system dynamics modeling serves as a good mean for simulating these performances of the interconnected services over a long period of time. This also means that that systems thinking is more of as mentioned earlier, systems thinking is differentiated from linear thinking in that it looks at the feedback mechanisms and how they affect the overall picture of, of a system. So more concretely, the IUSRI created from the system dynamics modeling, it can be used as a decision support tool to map these interconnections out and backed up by the graphical user interface. However, since this is just the first model, there can still be potential future enhancements. Uh, one being including more feedback among components, maybe particularly with the impact of city attractiveness in the city, because population drives the demand for services, but improving these services might attract a larger population. So you see here that there's a feedback, which means that there has to also be budget allocation limits for the for growing a service, which goes hand in hand with setting appropriate LGU targets. This is because finance represents an additional constraint to the set of initiatives that can be simulated. And lastly, as a decision support tool, the IUSRI can and shouldn't be used like by itself. It should be complemented with spatial analysis, such as GIS, and characterization of other dimensions that are difficult to frame in a services approach, such as soft variables like diversity, inclusivity, trust networks, maybe even happiness. Okay, and with that, I will hold on. Okay, and with that, I will present the video on how to actually use this USRI model along with the graphical user interface with its sliders. I will hand the floor over to Doc Kendra once again, so she can show the video.
Okay, thank you so much. So, oh, sorry. Okay. So we thought you might want to have a more concrete idea of what the model actually looks like and how to use it. So I'll be sharing with you a video that shows the software platform and how you can use it to generate your own scenarios. I hope you'll be able to hear the sound of the video as well.
Hi, I will be taking you through a demonstration on how to use Vensim based on the files we have given you. Alright, so first things first, open the Vensim application. Once there, you will see the screen, and on the upper left portion, File. Select Open Model and look for where you have saved the file. In this case, it is under Downloads, and we will be using Pasig's model for an example. So select this and press Open. It will take you to the Pasig model screen, and on the lower left portion, you will see a list of views. So let's go to this first one. You will also see that there are 6 different GUI or graphical user interface views. These contain sliders for adjustment later. You will also notice that there are other views, but it should be noted that the model variables in these views are in stock flow format and the users should not change unless he or she has prior training in system dynamics. This is because any alterations may affect the model outcome and the graphs. Alright, now that we have opened it, how exactly do we run a scenario? So let's take, for example, business as usual. Suppose that there is no BAU scenario or business as usual, either because it was corrupted or you couldn't find it. Let's just make one. Because in this case, the model that we have presented or given you is in default settings, meaning to say that they are under business as usual settings. All right, in order to do this, designate a file name on this text box over here, call it BAU for business as usual. After that, select simulate. So as you can see, new graphs have appeared, and these will be under the BAU scenario. Besides the BAU, we have also given you another scenario in which takes into account the city priority scenarios. And how do we open them and run them? All right, so on the upper right portion, you will see Control Panel. Select this and look for the Datasets tab, which we are already in. You will see 2 windows here, the left and the right box. On the left, under Available Info, this lists the datasets that Vensim can find in the same directory where the model file was located. They are in .vdf, or if your Vensim version is above 8.0, .vdfx. Either way, it can be opened. To load a scenario, select one of these files, .vdf or .vdfx, double-click them, or you can select them and press one of these arrows in the middle column. All right. So once on the right box, you will see that the graphs have changed, meaning to say that these are the loaded scenarios. All right, so now that we know how to open and run the different simulations in the model, what if I want to be able to change the graphs based on the configurations I want, such as the city priorities? All right, so that also can be done. As you recall, these GUIs have their own sliders which can be adjusted based on the configurations. So first, we have the SERI, or the Socio-Economic Resilience Index, which contains all of the socio-economic variables such as the health targets, the education targets, the protection targets, and the housing. Next, we have the UERI, or the Urban Ecosystem Resilience Index, which contains all of the urban ecosystem services such as the cultural service, the provisioning service, and the regulating service. Lastly, we have the IUSRI, or the Integrated Urban Services Resilience Index. This is a consolidation of both the UERI and SERI, and both have weights weighed equally. It should be noted that the sliders must be equal to 1 when changing them because of this weight. So how exactly do I change these sliders based on the configurations? So for purpose of demonstration, we will show you the UERI GUIs of Pasig. So head on over to the list of views and select this second view. And here you will see a list of sliders and as well as the graphs presented. You will notice that these sliders are set to the lowest value. And how do we change them? All right, so head on here to the stop portion and select Synthesim. So now you will notice that these sliders have actually moved back to their default settings. You will notice that as I move these different sliders, the graphs will change. So suppose that we want to reflect how these city priorities are translated into the model. Take, for example, Pasig land use change to add more cultural services. This can be done in the model by adjusting this fraction of parks as A and GA over here, which also means agriculture and green space area. This is also inherently tied up to land use. And what does it mean to increase this fraction? So we assume that recreational spaces, often concrete, are converted to green space or areas with vegetation. This provides cultural services without sacrificing or adding new land, given the problem of limited land in the city. Additionally, green space provide other services such as cleaner air and carbon sequestration, resulting in a higher UERI score. So as you can see, as I move this, the score also gets higher. This idea can promote mixed land use, which maximizes land use services. So now that I'm done configuring these sliders based on the configurations that I want, what exactly can I do with them? Well, you can do two things. You can save the scenario based on what you want, and you can also save the graphs so that you can paste them somewhere else. All right, so on to the first step. So say you're done adjusting these sliders and that you have the configurations you want based on maybe the city goals. So head on over here to save this run to, select it, and then a pop-up window will appear. So here you will want to save and rename the file you want. Let's name this user1 for this example. So in this case, you will want to press save. And you will also notice that it will be saved in the directory where the other files and other scenarios are also loaded. All right. So now that you have saved it, this run will be saved and can be loaded with the other runs next time you run this model. So after I've saved this new scenario with all these configurations, how do I save the graph that's been generated? Okay, so after all of this, select Stop Setup over here, and you will notice how these sliders have reset. However, the graphs have not. So select this graph, or one of these graphs, for example, select Copy. Now you can be able to paste them on other Microsoft applications such as Word and PowerPoint. However, you can't paste them on other applications such as Google Docs or Google Slides. So what if I want to save the scenario but keep the default BAU settings? All right. So once you exit the model, select X over here, select no, you do not want to save so that when you exit, the model will be at BAU settings once you open it again. Now that you know of the basics, thank you for listening to this demonstration, and I hope this has taught you something about Vensim and how to use these graphs.
Okay. So that concludes our presentation and our demonstration for the IUSRI graphs and models. I will now hand the floor over to Ms. Ina Salas and Ms. Jaira Sosol for the open forum.
Thank you so much, Kin, Dr. Kendra, and her team, along with Joe and Katrina. Now we move to the response from our representatives from the partner cities of SECAR PH. In the Zoom room, we have here the head of the Disaster Risk Reduction Management Office of Pasig City, Mr. Bryant Wong, who will be giving a response on the models presented today. May I now call on Mr. Bryant Wong.
Hi po, magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Hello?
Thank
Magandang
you,
hapon po.
Brian. Yes, we're here.
Hi ma'am.
Hi.
Just short, upon hearing yung mga information na kanina, so
I'll show my video, Brian, so you will know I'm here.
yes
Hi,
ma'am.
Brian.
Naka-ano po tayo naka-presentation yata.
Oh.
Naka-share screen pa yata ma'am. Pero yun nga po,
yeah.
upon seeing the yung sa resilience, syempre
Do you want to share your screen, Brian?
hindi
Do
na
you
po,
want to share your screen?
hindi na po, just
No
a
more
short
now, okay.
information about yan sa CCARP and sa
Okay.
partnership sa DRRM. So we're gearing towards resilience eh. Syempre lahat naman tayo is medyo bugbog na rin yung word na resilience. So yun nga, for quantifying resilience, we need basis. Number one, we need ano ba ang goal natin, ano ba ang vision, mission. Yun yung pinaka-start ng every resilience eh, di ba? Lalo in Pasig City. So yun, kasama yun sa strategic planning namin recently na we've conducted strat planning, and syempre our aim is towards a smart city. Yun naman talaga lahat eh. But we need to measure nga, we need to know the outputs kung okay ba siya or hindi, or ano ba yung target natin sa lahat, ano ba ang goals natin, and towards quantifying resilience, we need basis, we need programs, we need justification sa lahat, ma'am. Diba? Tama po, Ma'am Emma, diba? So, in measuring it with the tool that you have, malaking bagay sa amin.
Yes, Brian.
And syempre, we're gearing towards innovations. We're gearing towards new programs, new things sa LGU. So, sabi nga ni Mayor meron siyang quote or meron siyang sinabi sa amin yung big, hairy, audacious goals, 'di ba? So, yung BHAG. So, the BHAG kasi is more of we want to dream big as a city. We want to dream big as a DRMO. We want to yun yung big eh. Yung hairy naman is more of magulo. So magulo, innovation, so additional informations, and syempre audacious. Those are the targets of the mayor, and we're applying it not only to the city but also to the DRMO. Yun, more of yun po yung target namin, Ma'am Emma, and yun nga, in partnership po syempre with your group na sana matupad na at
Thank you,
matuloy na rin.
Brian.
Oo. And yung pinaka-sample ko nga dyan is yung mga impossible like yung drone. Why don't we have the disinfecting drone to be paghatid ng mga relief goods? Let's make it a sample yung sa Catanduanes, yung nangyari sa Catanduanes. Nagpadala kami ng tulong doon, food packs and also financial assistance. Pero what we could see there is we need to provide them additional resources na, for example, imposibleng ma-reach. So you use drones, di ba? And you'll use a lot of resources and innovations for that. So those are the things na ano, it's beyond our control and it's beyond our goal. So lalagpas pa tayo. So rather than give your 100%, we give it at 150 or 200% for that.
Okay.
So yun, Doc. Yun lang naman. And we're looking forward in using the ano, syempre, we're looking forward in every opportunity na mabigay sa amin, lalo na sa mga private sector and NGO and CSOs.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate your giving us your very valuable time. I know you're extremely busy. So please tell Mayor Vico we're very thankful and appreciative of the partnership. Yeah, we will proceed. We'll have a meeting again with you, and I'm coordinating with the Ateneo Innovation Center for those drones and other things. Okay,
Yes,
thank
po.
you, Brian. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, no, Sir Brian. Now we move to the open forum portion of our webinar. This will be moderated by Ms. Jairus Carmela Osol of the Department of Environmental Science, Ateneo de Manila University, and the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. For the open forum, we will be getting your questions from the Zoom chat and the Facebook Live comment section. I now call on Jairus also to moderate the forum.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So we will now proceed to answering your questions. If you still have more questions, as Ina said, feel free to type up your questions in the chat box and we will get to them shortly. So we will start with a question from Engineer Dexter Law, which will be, which is, can the
Hi,
models
Dex. Thank
and
you.
and the models be used to simulate scenarios
Yeah.
and do
Thank you, Dex.
All right, so let me just repeat the question from Engineer Law. Can the models be used to simulate scenarios and do an estimate of real values other than indexes? Or is this not the purpose of the model? I'll direct this question to Dr. Gotango Gonzalez.
So thank you for that question. Before I answer that, I just wanted to share, if Sir Brian is still here, that we're actually putting together the package for the local government units. So the model with the scenarios and the user's guide for Pasig and for Valenzuela. We're just testing the user's guide now to make sure that it's something that is clear and easy to understand. So we're looking forward po to be able to turn this over and get your feedback on the usefulness of what we have and how we can build on it in the future. And just looking at the questions that have come in, actually really good questions, pointing the way towards how this model can evolve in the future. So the question on whether it can be used to simulate scenarios and do an estimate of real values other than indices. Okay, so as we have seen in the video, so we try to make a graphical user interface so that the users who have no prior experience with system dynamics or Vensim can try simulating their own scenarios by adjusting the sliders and then looking at the graphs and saving those graphs. Now, as to the question of whether we can estimate real values other than indices, I suppose the question there is, what do we mean by real values, right? Because if we say that we want to quantify resilience, what is resilience in a concrete sense? Admittedly, this was really one of our challenges at the start. This is a foundational challenge. just trying to grapple with the concept of resilience, which is very nuanced and complex, but also at the same time, not something that is very obvious in terms of how we're supposed to be measuring it, right? So what is our framing for resilience, and what are the concrete measurable indicators that we can use to be able to say that something is becoming more resilient or less resilient? So that is actually a challenge that we grappled with at the start. And that's why we, for this model, settled on using the services approach, because it's something that is concrete, but at the same time intuitive in terms of how to understand the numbers that are generated. So if you have an index that says zero point 0.8 for a specific indicator, then it's easy to understand na, oh, it means we're only providing 80% of what is needed by the city, right? So it's measurable in a simple way. It's easy to understand. Yes, it's an index, but it represents uh, a specific it represents a specific value. It's the ratio of demand to supply, of quality to the standard. Okay, so in a sense, we're trying to balance. In some cases kasi, indices are a bit opaque. It's a combination of so many things that it's hard to translate in an operational sense. What did that mean? So here, yes, it's an index, but we try to design it to reflect a reality uh, insofar as how we frame resilience and how resilience can be reflected in reality. I hope that sort of answers the question, and I'd be happy to have a discussion about this later on, because resilience is such a rich topic with so many different interpretations.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. And this is also for Dr. Butanco Gonzalez. This is from Mr. Leandro Poco. How do the modeling methods account for the vertical gross floor areas or potential carrying capacity of the building stock?
I will admit to you that's something we also grappled with. We were trying to improve the model by putting in limits to the growth of built-up area, to the growth of businesses. For example, in the SERI model, we have the historical increase in businesses. The businesses need offices. Or you have the growth of housing, and the housing needs land. So we were trying to build in more limits to these things because we're limited based on land. And the problem that, well, not problem, but the situation that we ran into was really the idea of vertical development. That even if you have only this much, hectares of land, if you build vertically, you can actually accommodate more businesses, more low-income housing. And at the moment, that was something that we weren't sure how to put a limit on. That's something that we have to talk to the local government units with, right? Uh, will they have specific policies that will limit vertical development, and how? So that we can put that into the model as a limit on the land use feature. So at the moment, it's not there yet, but it's something that we have recognized is a challenge, and we'd like to work more with the local government units to find out what their policies will be in terms of the vertical development.
Thank you, Dr. Butanco Gonzalez. This is also a related question from Mr. Poco, which I will field to Mr. Joseph Litam. The question is, how do modeling methods factor in accessibility and locational information of the projected requirements?
Hi, thank you for the question. Regarding accessibility to the information, so we structured our models in a way that our partners in the government can readily input the data that they do collect annually. So these data sets are available for anyone. They can just ask the government units. And so it's easier for them to input the data. But in terms of the structure, we would have to create specific structures per city to match what kind of data sets they collect and prioritize. So I think the information used in the model is accessible. You can just ask the local government units or the national government agencies, since those are the sources of our data. Did that I hope that answers the question.
If you were meaning also locational information, locational spatially, was that the meaning of the question?
Yes, though.
For that aspect, if we're talking about the spatial analysis, if you notice, system dynamics is good with the time aspect, but not as much with the spatial representation. And that's why we recommend to complement system dynamics with spatial analysis methods such as GIS.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kendra. Another question is from LG Antipolo, Rael Nunez. How accurate can this model project that a certain city can rely on its results in order for a certain city to address its issues?
Well, have you heard of the phrase GIGO? Garbage in, garbage out, right? We built the structure of the model, but a key aspect here, very crucial, are the data that are gathered by the city. For example, our estimates of the flows for procurement, for hiring, for the growth of businesses, for the provision of services. A lot of this is based on the city's historical data. So we can get a sense of the trends and build equations into the model. So in a sense, the model is reliable to the extent that the data gathering that has been done is reliable. But I would also just like to sort of caveat, it's not the intent of the model to be able to say when a certain service will reach a certain amount, so by a very specific time. System dynamics is not meant to make projections or predictions, sorry, it's not meant to make predictions in the same way that, say, weather models are meant to make predictions, right, for when the typhoon will come and where it will pass. The strength of system dynamics is in understanding trends and behaviors and how they are driven by the structure. So you take a look at the graphs and take a look at the sorts of interventions that have the most leverage, right? That will make the greatest increases, let's say, in the resilience score. But it shouldn't be taken to mean that by, for example, May of 2036, you would have already, for sure, 99%, you can be sure that you will have reached this score at this time. That's not the purpose of system dynamics modeling, but it's more to understand, to be able to rationalize your investment decisions based on the trends and behaviors that you see arising from the structure of the models.
All right, so I hope that was clear. Let's proceed to the next question. Can any of the speakers speak more about the soft variables like diversity and happiness?
So for the soft variables that we're talking about, we were for the UERI, we were actually supposed to include other variables such as maybe well-being that can be given by, let's say, the amount of green space and the amount of benefits derived from this green space. However, the problem was quantifying these. We had to go we had to try to make a quantifiable equation, such as like the amount of green space or the amount of green space per person, and would that actually be representative of like well-being of a person? If a person were to have this amount of like X amount of green space, would they be happy per se? Let's say.
Yeah. And so just to add to what Kina said, we recognize that there are many things important to a city that a city should provide, and not all of them are measurable. You can find a way to quantify them. For example, there is such a thing as the happiness index. So you can find ways to attach numbers to them, but it's a whole methodology in itself, how to attach numbers to soft variables like happiness, well-being, diversity, inclusivity, trust. And these are variables that are not suited for a services framework. Because when you say you're providing a service, you're matching that service to a demand. How do we think of trust that way? Providing a service of trust? It doesn't make as much sense as when you say providing a service for water, for energy, for food. So those are the challenges that we have with soft variables. But we know that they're important, right? You can have the most technologically advanced city, but if people are not happy, then the city may not be attractive. And that's where the other fields come in. So that's why we say that the model, the IUSRI, shouldn't be taken in isolation. We should be harvesting the methodologies of other fields, for example, sociological methods to investigate these soft variables. And that will make it even a more holistic and multidimensional analysis. I think that sometimes we want to have a sort of a one-stop shop, a model that can answer all our questions, but cities are really just so complex that what you need is a suite of tools. The model is just one in a suite of tools, and you need to use we need to use the approaches that are more appropriate for the other types of dimensions that we want to investigate.
Thank you, Dr. Kendra. Are there any other questions? This is from Maria Aurora Tabada. Can other LGUs access these tools?
For the ones we developed for the project, we have customized them actually for Pasig and for Valenzuela. So there are differences, slight differences in the model structure based on the data and the processes that are unique to Pasig versus to Valenzuela. So it may not work as well, let's say for another LGU, Quezon City, for example, to just take one of those models and use it for themselves. We'd have to check how different or how similar their data and processes are to Pasig and Valenzuela. That being said, if the opportunity arises, we could try at a generic model, but the difficulty there is that if it's generic, then the historical data, the trends are not pegged to any specific city. It might be an average among the cities. So it's not going to reflect the unique context of that city as much as if we were to customize it for that LGU.
I think we have gone to all of the questions. Do the audience have any more questions? Okay, so if there's none, I will turn over the floor to Ms. Ina Salas. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, for that. Perhaps before we do proceed to the closing remarks to be led by Dr. Porio, may I ask for final messages from our speakers? Perhaps starting from Joe, Kin, and then Dr. Kendra would be the last.
Okay.
Just final messages for our guests.
I'd like to thank everyone, especially our partners from the LGU, for making this research possible. They're very busy, and we would go there often, like thrice a week, and we just disturb them. So I think I'm very grateful. We're very grateful that you took the time to accommodate us always, and everyone's so nice and respectful, and we're super grateful for that. So while we're doing this project as a partnership for everyone, I think it went a lot smoother with all your help so far and your expertise, since we are only limited by what we know from environmental concepts, and then it's the LGUs, the people there who are experts at what they do. So that really helped us understand how the city works, how we can translate that to the model. So it really wouldn't have been possible without their help. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to say also that that we're very grateful, especially to those who really taught us about all of these fields. It was this really stressed out what I've been learning in my course, environmental science, about interdisciplinarity and how a city isn't just one service at a time. We have to look at the entire city system as a whole, and I hope that in with this model, it can actually sort of be representative of what the cities aim to accomplish, and I hope that this can also be useful for the other people who are studying resilience. And yes, that's about it. Thank you very much.
I'd like to echo Joe and Kin's thanks to Pasig and Valenzuela. Thank you for agreeing to be our case studies to develop this model. This model has been years in the making. We started with the first phase of the Coastal Cities at Risk project, learning about systems thinking and system dynamics from our partners in Canada way back in 2011, 2012. And from there, building small, simple models and trying to grasp with a concept as complex and nuanced like resilience, and trying to figure out how we can build something useful and actionable out of what we've learned with systems thinking, system dynamics, modeling, and towards the purpose of building resilience. And a lot of work has gone into this model, and for that, I thank the whole team, Joe, Kian, uh, Miss Jairus Hasol, Jean Hardelesa, Kitty Abenohar, who have been working tirelessly and putting so much effort into this. They can tell you we've had a lot of discussions and debates about the conceptual stuff as well as the operational things of how to translate these complex concepts into something that is more concrete. And even then, I think we will be the first to admit that despite all of the work and all of the moving parts in the model, there's still many things that we can improve, as your questions have also shown us. There are still other feedbacks, constraints, limits that we can put into the model to make it even more dynamic and to reflect the reality of life in our cities even better. So we hope that it won't stop here. We'll continue. As I mentioned, we're putting together the packages to give to the local government units. We hope that you try them out, give us feedback, let us know what will work for you and what doesn't, what you'd like to see. And then maybe we hope we can get another grant so that we can continue with this and build on this towards something that can really be part of your city resilience toolkit in the long run. So again, thank you to the team. Thank you to SICAR PH, to Doc Eva for this opportunity, and thank you to the local government units. Thank you to our participants today. We hope that you found this webinar entertaining, as Doc Emma said, and useful in some way.
Thank you very much, Doc Kendra, and Joe and Kim for that final messages. I now would like to call on Dr. Emma Porio to give her closing remarks. I saw that she was raising the MDRR, Master in Risk and Resilience, Master in Disaster
Yeah,
Risk and Resilience for sure. So, Doc Emma,
yeah. I'm advertising this because, as we say in Master of Disaster Risk Resilience, and I'd like to thank, Kendra and I created. Kendra was very excellent and really great when we were doing this program. And as we say in MDRR, problem focused, solutions driven with the systems lens. Most of our systems, whether it's local government or even universities, are so sectoral. So we need to be transsectoral, transdisciplinary, so that with the systems, we view it as systems, we can perhaps go forward towards resilience. So anyway, let me finish with my uh, marketing. We are going to open the application for the program sometime in March for the second year, for the school year 2021. All those, the RRMOs and LGUs and CPDOs, if you're interested, please write to us. So let me now close this program. I do not know what happened to Toby. Dr. Dairit, who is one of our council of advisors, promised me that she'll do the closing remark, being part of the National Academy of Science and Technology. But maybe he's busy giving all the seminars about VCO as a preventive, tool for COVID. So anyway, so in closing, let me thank the SD team headed by Dr. Kendra Gutanco Gonzalez, Joseph, Joaquin, and all the others. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank especially Brian Tuong, the CDRMO of Pasig. I really would like to thank him because I know the local governments are so busy with so many challenges now brought about by COVID and all the other related issues that local governments have to respond to. So I'm very grateful to Brian, to Mayor Vico, to Mariel, and the others. So also, I'd like to thank all those who attended. It is through your participation that these kinds of webinars work. We planned last year that we will have a synthesis conference for SICAR, PH, and MDRR, but as you all know, COVID had other plans. So we had to reconfigure, bounce forward and say how we can share the research findings of the different work packages. So thank you very much for attending. We will basically, I would like to thank and I'd like to congratulate the team of Dr. Gutanco Gonzalez for opening. This is for October, November. It is the Systems Dynamics team that is opening our Climate and Disaster Resilience Lecture Series 2020-21. So thank you, Kendra. Thank you and your team for opening it. I think it's highly successful and it's a great presentation. I think it has opened new avenues of how you should look at your challenges at the local level or even in your own universities and offices, how we can use systems thinking in analyzing, understanding the risks, and what are the solution pathways? What are the resilience pathways that we can craft out of this analysis? So thank you very much. I'm very happy. And I will say to Father Bobby, we're doing our work, Father, and also to our partners in the National Resilience Council and our partner LGUs in Naga, our partner universities, Ateneo de Naga University, University of the Philippines at Visayas, pamantasan ng lungsod ng Muntinlupa, pamantasan ng lungsod ng Valenzuela, and the Pasig City, of course. thank you, and we will welcome and see you again in our lecture series next week. Although next week here, but although we have an ongoing webinar series now entitled Climate, Resource Management, and Development, focusing on community resilience initiatives in Asia. And we made this for our Asian Scholars Program. For half of my students are stranded in Costa Rica, while the others have gone back to their countries in Japan, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. So tomorrow we will have another webinar, and on Thursday. So we would like to invite you to that. But really, for this afternoon, I am very grateful. I'm very grateful to those who attended. I can see that people from Naga, from Antipolo, from other parts of the Philippines have attended. So thank you very much. I also would like to have a shout out for Dexlo of Xavier University, because he was our partner in our EpiGrid training with the LGU. So thank you very much, Dex, for sharing a part of your time and asking those questions. Also, I'd like to thank Tess Tabada, who's also here, and I think Dr. Gay de Fiesta, our partner in UPB, was also here. So I am very grateful. I always tell people we're able to make, this project and these initiatives are working because of the wonderful support we're getting from you. So thank you very much, and we'll continue to see each other virtually, and hopefully soon we can visit you personally. So thank you and welcome, and appreciate very much your presence in our webinars. Okay, Ina?
Thank you so much, Dr. Emma, for you. Thank you to all the attendees and to all our speakers this afternoon. We will truly appreciate your feedback for the proceedings of today's webinar. So please send in your comments through our evaluation form at bit.ly/sdwebinar-eval. That's bit.ly/sdwebinar-eval. So please stay tuned on our Facebook page of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines, and subscribe to our website at Coastal Cities at Risk PH for updates on our next session. Thank you very much.
Okay, can we have a post-mortem, Ina? Is Dr. Ken still here?
Yes, they're still here. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. So,
Thank you.
okay, we'll. Ina, can this PhD